This lecture is on the Aorist tense, specifically on one form of the Aorist tense form. In a nutshell, the Aorist tense portrays action that happens in the past, and it has a perfective aspect. We'll explain that all as we go on. The past tense in Greek is covered by two tenses. We've already learned about the imperfect. The imperfect tense depicts ongoing action in past time. Today we're learning about the aorist, which depicts complete action in past time. The aorist can be formed in two different ways. The first aorist, which we're learning today, an example here is the verb luo. Add an augment and a tense formative, sigma alpha, and you get elusa. The second aorist, which we'll learn about next class, is an example here is elabon, and that's from the verb lambano. You have an augment and you have a set of endings, but no tense formative, and what we're seeing here is that tense stem, that verb stem, is a little bit different than the actual lexical form that we learned. That's a key part of the second aorist, but we'll get to that next week. For now, let's focus on the first aorist. And we'll talk about the meaning of the aorist tense. So whether a verb is first or second aorist, it will have the same meaning. So those two pathways of forming the aorist really don't make a difference in the essential part of the meaning of the verb. So as I said earlier, time of action in the aorist tense is past time, and this is in the indicative mood. When we move out to other moods, which we'll do in Greek too, the past time aspect, the past time meaning of the aorist is no longer prominent. What is prominent in both the indicative and the other moods is the kind of action or aspect, and here the perfective aspect is key. What does perfective aspect mean? It means the action being depicted by the author is viewed as complete or as a whole. So when we look at action as a whole, we are looking at the beginning, the end, and everything in between. That's the idea of the aorist tense. I'm going to go over some main uses of the aorist tense in the Greek New Testament. The first one is the constative sense, and it depicts the action as a whole without regard to its beginning or end or the length of time it took to accomplish the action. Here's an example from Romans 5:14. E basilouse ha thanatos apa Adam mechri mo ouseos. Death reigned from Adam until Moses. Okay? So it's looking at the action as a whole. From the beginning, without regard to its beginning or its ending, just the action altogether and everything in between. The other nuance of the aorist tense is the inceptive meaning, and this is kind of like the inceptive imperfect, exactly the same, and emphasizes the beginning of a state of being or an action. So here we have an example from John 11:35. E dak rusen ha Jesus. Jesus began to weep. We could also translate it, that's also translated Jesus wept, but Jesus began to weep. The idea that it's the beginning of the action of Jesus' weeping. Finally, the epistolary aorist. The epistolary aorist is used by writers of letters when they put themselves in the position of their readers and they look back on the time of writing as a past event. Okay, even though Paul was writing these words and it was very present to him, he's imagining that his readers are reading the letter received later, and he writes it in past time. So, this is Philemon, verse 19. Ego Paulos, egrapsa te eme keri. I, Paul, write this with my own hand. Okay? So even though this is a past tense, it's translated as a present because Paul is in the action of writing as he's putting these words down. Let's talk about voice and the aorist tense. The aorist tense has active, middle, and passive forms. But note the distinction between what I would say regular omega verbs and middle only. So, eluo, our paradigm verb. Elusa, this is the active meaning. It's the active form and has active meaning. Elusa main, okay, this is the middle form and it has middle meaning. And there is a passive form, eluthane. That's passive, and it can be passive or middle, depending on context and depending on the verb. The lexical form of peruomai indicates that this is a middle-only verb. So peruomai and erkomai and prosukomai, all sorts of omai verbs. If it ends in an omai, it's a middle only. So it has a middle form, e peru sa main. So it's middle form and it's middle meaning which is in a sense active, that's subject involved. I was, I go, or I went. That's probably better. I went, or I traveled. A peruthane. There's a passive form, but it too has this middle meaning of the middle only verb. So this also means I went or I traveled. Here's the paradigm for the aorist active. Elusa, elusas, elusen, elusamen, elusata, eluson. We'll get to the morphology later, but you're seeing a pattern there. The augment and the sigma alpha, and endings put on the after this tense, what's called the tense formative for the aorist, the first aorist. We'll get to the morphology later. Here's the paradigm for the aorist middle. There's a typo in that first box, so it's alusa main. Okay, I forgot the new in the eta in there. Eluso, again, that's a bit different, but we'll get to the morphology later. Elusato, elusamatha, elusasta, elusanto. And finally, here's the paradigm for the aorist passive. Eluthane, eluthase, eluthane, eluthamen, elutheta, eluthason. And passive meaning. I was loosed, you were loosed, he was loosed, etc., etc. Eluthane, eluthase, eluthay, eluthamen, elutheta, eluthason. So let's talk about the parts of the first aorist. So the basic components of the first aorist include an augment, which is an epsilon or a lengthened vowel. So in your verbs that begin with an epsilon or an alpha, it becomes an eta. If you have a verb that begins with an omicron, it's lengthened to an omega. Okay? Then you have the verb stem, and you have something called a tense formative, like what we saw in the future. Remember, the future had a sigma. This has a sigma alpha. And then you have personal endings. So I've used the example of the first plural here, because here we can see all the components together. Augment, verb stem, this is using the verb luo, the tense formative, and the personal endings. Alu, sa, men. Alu, sa, men. We loosed. So I want to talk a little bit about the component parts. So again, noting the augment, again, it's an epsilon or a lengthened vowel. So luo, epsilon in front. Agapao, alpha lengthens to an eta. So the augment is the marker of past time. We see it in the imperfect and we see it in the aorist. We don't see it in other forms. So that is the clear marker that you're dealing with a past tense. I want to talk about, again, the parts of the first aorist, and there's something I mentioned earlier called the tense formative. Okay, the tense formative, the first aorist uses two tense formatives, a sigma alpha for the active in the middle and the the for the passive. Okay, and that tense formative is placed between the tense stem and the personal endings. So remember, in the verb tenses we've used so far, the present and the imperfect and the future, we still have a connecting vowel. Okay? Remember, connecting vowel, lu, ah, men. Okay, that's the connecting vowel. Well, because we have these vowels linked to the tense formative, we no longer need this vowel, connecting vowel, to connect the verb stem with the personal endings. So connecting vowels are not needed in the first aorist. They're gone. And of course, the personal endings get stuck on. So in the active form, you have a zero ending in the first person, a sigma on the end, a zero ending, and a movable nu for the third singular, a men for the first plural, a te, and a nu. So elu sa, elu sas, elu sen, elu samen, elu sata, elu san. In the middle, again, main, omega, ta, metha, sta, nto. And the passive, nu, sigma, zero ending, men, ta, and san. But there's a few notes that we need to do. The first singular active does not have a nu. So remember, back to the imperfect. The imperfect is lu, on. Okay, had a nu on the end. The first aorist, first singular, doesn't have a nu. It's just a zero ending. So that's why you get lu, sa. Just augment, verb stem, tense formative, zero ending. So that's what's happening there. Now, the second singular middle has no alpha. It has this ending and an omega. Why is that? So what's happening with this second aorist middle here? Augment, lu, tense formative, and the real ending is sigma omicron for these middle endings. So, elu sa, let's walk through it. Elu sa, so this sigma sitting in between the alpha and the omicron drops, and you get the alpha and the omicron coming together, and of course that forms an omega. So the final form is e, lu, so. That explains that middle form there. Those are really the only kind of tricky things about the connection of the personal endings onto the end of the verb with the tense formative. But there are some variations in form that we need to note. These are, like what we saw in the future, verbs that end in certain consonants. And when these consonants encounter the sigma alpha tense formative, primarily the sigma, just like in the future, they change. So blepo, I see, becomes e blepsa. So that pi encounters the sigma and it becomes upsi. Okay, that's why you get e blepsa. So here's a summary of the changes that occur. So these verbs that end in a pi, a beta, or a pi tau, or a phi, when they encounter a sigma, they form this psi. So I used the example of blepo in the previous slide. Then there's the palatals. So a kappa, a gamma, a sigma kappa, a double sigma, or a chi. These guys actually, their primitive root has a palatal, so that's why I'm putting them there. That's why they're putting there. But whatever, when these types of verbs encounter a sigma, that goes into an xi. So dioko becomes e dioksa. Okay, the kappa and the sigma form the xi. And finally, dentals, that is tau, delta, any verb that ends in a zeta and a theta, you add a sigma, and that letter drops, and you just get a sigma. So baptizo becomes e baptisa. Okay, you just see the sigma. So just be aware when you are analyzing future forms, especially verbs whose stems have these types of consonants, that you're going to see some changes. Another variation form occurs with contract verbs. Now, we already saw changes that happen with contract verbs in the future. Similar thing happens here. So agapao, you get the lengthening, you get the alpha lengthening to an eta, you get the addition of the tense formative, and in the first singular, the zero ending, so it's agapesa. That's I loved. Poieo, again, the epsilon's added. The eta, epsilon, sorry, it lengthens to an eta. And you get the tense formative sigma alpha, zero ending, a poiesa, I did. And finally, plerao, add an augment. The omicron connecting vowel lengthens to an omega. You add the sigma alpha tense formative, zero ending, a plerosa, I filled. So remember, contract verbs, that stem vowel lengthens prior to the addition of the tense formative. That's the only real change that happens with the contract verbs. Finally, when we're dealing with the aorist passive, those stem consonants also create some changes. So again, labials, pi and beta, when they encounter the theta, so the theta eta of the tense formative, that theta becomes phi theta. So blepo becomes a blepsthane. a blepsthane. So the pi changes with reference to this theta, a blepsthane. The palatals, kappa and gamma, when they encounter theta, become chi theta. So ego becomes axthane, axthane, axthane. And finally the dentals, delta and theta, when they encounter a theta, they become sigma theta. So baptizo, which its primitive root ends with a delta, baptid, the delta becomes a sigma, and the theta becomes a sigma prior to the theta. So a baptisthane, a baptisthane. So note these changes. Be aware of these changes that occur with certain consonants. So we see changes with consonants in the active form. We also see them in the passive form, like this. And that's everything for the first aorist tense. I encourage you to read the handout and the chapter on the first aorist, and we'll talk more about this in class. Until next time, keep studying your Greek.